Today we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. And the purpose of the reproductive system is to make more individuals of our species. And those individuals have a great deal of genetic variation because they're formed by the union of the sperm and the egg. For the sperm and the egg to have formed, they underwent a process called meiosis, in which genetic information is mixed and matched in unique ways. But we're going to focus here on the female reproductive system, and then in another lecture we'll talk about the male reproductive system. So this is a lateral or side view of the female, looking at the female reproductive system as if one leg had been removed from the female. And so let's just go through the parts and focus on what they do. So first of all, we have the ovary in the top of the slide. And the ovaries, the purpose of the ovary is to produce eggs by a process known as oogenesis. And oogenesis is meiosis, so that the eggs, like we said before, have a great deal of genetic variation. And they are haploid, and they will then be fertilized by the sperm, which is also haploid, to create a diploid organism. So every 28 days, one of the eggs is released from the ovary in a process called ovulation. Okay, and so that is the release of the eggs from the ovary. And then the egg will travel down the uterine tube, sometimes called the fallopian tube or oviduct, which is the site of fertilization, so where the sperm will meet the egg. And then if the egg is fertilized, it will travel down the uterine tube and implant itself in the wall of the uterus. The wall of the uterus is called the endometrium, and the muscular layer, which this line is pointing to, is called the myometrium. But at any rate, the fertilized egg will implant into the endometrium. And after a gestation period of 9 months, the fully developed fetus will then go through the cervix. And the cervix is the opening to the uterus, which dilates and allows the passage of the baby into the vagina or the birth canal. One of the things that happens when a woman is pregnant is that she has to urinate a lot. And so I'm drawing boxes around the urinary bladder and the urethra, which are technically part of the urinary system. But the point of bringing it up in this lecture is to show you the proximity between the urinary bladder and the uterus. And so when the uterus gets very big with the developing baby, the baby rests on the urinary bladder and causes the woman to have a smaller urinary bladder and also to feel as though she needs to urinate quite often. Urine is stored in the urinary bladder and then exits through the urethra. And then just anterior to the opening of the urethra is the clitoris, an organ that functions in sexual arousal and orgasm. The clitoris, urethral opening, and vaginal opening are all protected by the labia major and labia minor. So the labia minor labia means lips, and so the minor lips are smaller and more internal than the labia major, which are the outer lips. Collectively, the term for the external female genitalia is called the vulva. I'd like to talk about the female menstrual cycle, which refers to the changes that take place in the female body over a period of 28 days, which leads to the release of the egg, and also menstruation, which is the shedding of the uterine lining. But let's start by taking a look at the ovary. This is going to be a cross section through the ovary. A female is born with all the eggs that her ovaries will release, and they're in a primordial or immature state called primordial follicles. But every 28 days, one of these follicles will continue on through meiosis and become a primary follicle. And then a more mature secondary follicle will form, and then a mature follicle that contains an egg that is ready for ovulation. Ovulation will then occur, and the egg will be released into the uterine tube. It's now called a secondary oocyte, and the release of the egg is called ovulation. But what remains behind is called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body. And the primary purpose of the corpus luteum is to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which maintain the uterine lining so a fertilized egg can implant and grow. And estrogen and progesterone also prevent the ovary from releasing another egg. If there is a fertilization event, the fertilized egg is called a zygote, and the zygote undergoes several rounds of mitosis before implantation in the uterine lining. And then if there's no fertilization event, the corpus luteum dies and becomes the corpus albicans, which is the white body. And then there is no release of estrogen and progesterone, so the uterine lining sloughs off, and we call this menstruation. And also there's no inhibition of the development of a new egg, and so that cycle then begins again. We can put brackets around the parts of the ovary to show what happens during the 28-day cycle. So this bracket would be days 1 through 13, and that's called the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. And then the other side of the ovary is days 14 through 28, which is called the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Let's go ahead and take a look at the menstrual cycle on the graph. Okay, so this is a graph of the female menstrual cycle, and it goes for 28 days. And just write female menstrual cycle here, and realize that this is sort of 4 graphs in one. The top graph is gonadotropin secretion, which refers to the secretion of hormones from the anterior pituitary in the brain. And then the next one down is called the ovarian cycle, which we just went through, which is the sequence of events that are going to occur in the ovary during the 28 days. And then you have the ovarian hormone cycle is the third graph, which looks at the levels of estrogen and progesterone that are coming from the ovary at different times of the 28-day period. And then finally you have the thickness of the endometrium, which is showing you the buildup of the uterine lining during the 28-day cycle. Let's just quickly look at some of the primary features of this monthly cycle. So day 1 is known as the first day of blood flow. So this is really when a woman's period begins. And then the period will last from 5 to 7 days approximately. And then we can also see on this graph that ovulation will occur at approximately day 14. Let's look at the top of the slide and look at what's going on in the brain. The hypothalamus is releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to travel to the pituitary gland to cause the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, or FSH and LH. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to cause the developing follicle in the uterus to begin to mature. That's why it's called follicle stimulating hormone. And then levels of luteinizing hormone are also going to increase right up until day 14, when there is a surge of luteinizing hormone that is coincident with the release of the egg from the ovary. Also at that time, there is a significant amount of estrogen which has been stimulated to be released from the ovary by luteinizing hormone. And so that estrogen is then going to be one of the primary factors in leading to the buildup of the uterine wall. That uterine wall is preparing for a implantation event. And so the luteinizing hormone that leads to the release of the egg is called the LH surge. So I'm writing that at the top here. And then levels of LH are also going to cause the corpus luteum to mature, which is then going to secrete estrogen and progesterone that inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone from being released from the hypothalamus. Okay, so just going back and looking at what's happening with estrogen in the ovary is that estrogen is going to be helping to build up the endometrial lining, and then progesterone is going to be maintaining that uterine lining. But then when the corpus luteum dies and those two hormones are no longer being made, the endometrium is going to slough off, and then that will lead to day 1 or the first day of blood flow. Let's just do a little review of some of the main points that we talked about in this lecture video. And so number 1, the egg is fertilized in the uterine tube. That's an important thing to remember. The fertilized egg is called a zygote, and it goes from haploid, the haploid egg, to the diploid zygote. And then the zygote is going to go through multiple mitotic divisions in the uterine tube as it travels down the uterine tube, and then it will embed in the endometrium, which is the thickened uterine lining. Estrogen builds the lining, and progesterone maintains the lining of the uterus. And these two hormones are secreted by the corpus luteum, and the maintenance of the corpus luteum also inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone released from the hypothalamus, and then that inhibits the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary. And I wrote birth control pill in parentheses so that you would know that the birth control pill is made up of progesterone and estrogen, because the effect of those two hormones is ultimately to prevent an ovulation event and prevent someone from getting pregnant. The corpus luteum is maintained by hormones that are secreted by the developing fetus, developing embryo in the womb. If there's no fertilization event, then the corpus luteum is going to degenerate, and levels of progesterone and estrogen are going to drop. And once again, the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then the cycle will begin again. And finally, let's talk about what happens when the ovaries stop doing their job. And this is known as menopause. And so menopause starts at different times for different women. This is when the ovaries cease to function, and usually happens variable times, usually around age 50. and estrogen and progesterone are not secreted then, and the cycle is not maintained. That's a good place to end this lecture.